Ladies and gentlemen, the Medici rise did not begin with swords or bloodlines. It began with ledgers and coin. In the early 15th century, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici laid the foundation of what would become the most powerful bank in Europe, the Medici Bank. But this was no ordinary financial institution. It wasn't just a place where gold was stored or lent. It was the lifeblood of empires. The genius of the Medici was in how they transformed banking from a merchant craft into a tool of domination. They created a system of branch banks spread across major European cities: Rome, Venice, London, Bruges, Avignon, connected by a network of trusted agents and coded correspondents. This allowed them to quietly move money, fund wars, settle royal debts, and influence political decisions across borders, all without ever marching an army. At a time when charging interest was still frowned upon by the church, the Medici mastered the art of disguising profit as legitimate service fees, allowing them to accumulate vast fortunes while maintaining a pious public image. Their relationship with the church was especially lucrative. Acting as bankers to the papacy, the Medici handled the vast inflow of tithes and indulgences, giving them not just wealth, but spiritual leverage over Europe's most powerful institution. This financial power became the backbone of their political strategy. Money bought loyalty. Money silenced rivals. Money placed Medici allies in high office. They used their banking wealth to fund political campaigns, influence elections, and even install family members in positions of authority without ever needing to claim overt political power themselves. And because their financial influence was invisible, hidden behind contracts, accounts, and coded letters, it was almost impossible to attack directly. To go to war with the Medici was not to confront an army. It was to wake up one morning and find your credit gone, your debts called in, your allies bankrupt, and your enemies suddenly well-funded. The Medici didn't just make money, they made money make power. And through that power, they reshaped the political and cultural map of Europe. While most great dynasties sought crowns and thrones, the Medici understood that true power often lies behind them. From the shadows of palaces and cathedrals, they pulled the strings of rulers and regimes, manipulating the course of history not through conquest, but through influence, persuasion, and wealth. They did not need to rule in name. They ruled in effect. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Il Magnifico, exemplified this philosophy. Though never king or pope, he governed Florence with a grip stronger than any monarch, controlling elections, guiding public policy, and dominating the city's affairs through networks of loyalty and patronage. He mastered the art of power without position, ensuring that every official in Florence owed their loyalty, and often their livelihood, to him. But the Medici's influence didn't stop at the city's borders. They extended their reach into the royal courts of Europe by strategically placing family members and loyal allies into key roles. Through careful marriage alliances and vast financial support, they brokered deals with monarchs and secured political favors. A Medici daughter, Catherine de' Medici, would become Queen of France and later its de facto ruler, shaping the fate of a nation through cunning diplomacy and ruthless resolve. The Church, too, became a Medici stronghold. Their immense wealth and influence enabled them to control the papal elections and install relatives into the highest echelons of religious authority. Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici became Pope Leo X, and his reign marked a turning point in church history, one where the Medici transformed the papacy into a powerful extension of their family's ambitions. Later, Giulio de' Medici would ascend as Pope Clement VII, further tightening the family's grip on spiritual power. Through these positions, the Medici dictated wars, peace treaties, and dynastic marriages. They acted as kingmakers, influencing the selection and survival of rulers. They brokered alliances that shaped empires. They decided who would rule and who would fall, all while cloaked in the soft garments of bankers and patrons. Unlike other powers who flaunted their authority, the Medici perfected the strategy of quiet domination. They understood that the throne was just a symbol, but the man who chose the king and financed his rule was the one who truly held power. Through their subtle maneuvering and behind-the-scenes orchestration, the Medici became the true sovereigns of an age obsessed with titles. While they wore none to control the soul of Europe, the Medici knew they had to master its most sacred institution, the Catholic Church. In an age when religion shaped not just belief but law, culture, and kingship, the Church was not only a spiritual authority, it was the engine of power itself. The Medici, ever attuned to influence, moved strategically to make the Church their instrument. Their first great triumph came through finance. By becoming bankers to the papacy, the Medici entrenched themselves in the heart of ecclesiastical power. They handled the vast streams of wealth flowing into Rome from across Christendom, indulgences, tithes, donations, and in doing so, gained leverage over the institution that claimed to speak for God. The Medici could delay funds, expedite payments, or offer loans to influential cardinals, each action a thread in the web of control they spun. But influence through money was only the beginning. The Medici aimed higher. They sought to place themselves on the very throne of St. Peter. And they did. In 1513, Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X. A man born into a banking dynasty now wore the triple crown of papal authority. His reign marked the transformation of the papacy into a Medici domain. Under Leo X, the Vatican became both a court of lavish spectacle and a theater of politics. He used his power to enrich the family, promote Medici allies, and solidify Florence's dominance. More than that, he blurred the line between religious sanctity and secular ambition, funding wars, commissioning opulent art, and selling indulgences to finance both. The Medici influence over the Church continued with Pope Clement VII, formerly Giulio de' Medici, who reigned during one of the most turbulent periods in Church history. During his papacy, the Protestant Reformation exploded across Europe, and Rome itself was sacked by the armies of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet, even amid this chaos, Clement maneuvered to protect Medici interests, negotiating with emperors, manipulating royal marriages, and ensuring that Medici bloodline and ideology remained intact. Their religious control also extended to the spiritual lives of the faithful. By sponsoring theologians, bishops, and clergy loyal to their cause, the Medici steered the interpretation of doctrine and the appointment of ecclesiastical authority. Churches across Europe echoed with sermons favorable to their rule, and resistance to the family could be framed not just as rebellion, but as heresy. The Medici understood something profound, that the Church was not just a guardian of souls, but a gatekeeper to legitimacy. By mastering religion, they legitimized their wealth, sanctified their political moves, and cloaked their ambitions in divine approval. They didn't simply believe in God, they used him as a partner in power. While kings waged wars for territory and glory, the Medici waged a different kind of campaign, one of the mind, the spirit, and the soul. They understood that lasting power is not just written in laws or carved in stone, but etched into culture, whispered in poetry, painted on ceilings, and taught in schools. The Medici did not just patronize the Renaissance, they engineered it. From the 15th to the 17th century, the Medici bankrolled some of the greatest minds in human history. Their patronage wasn't merely generosity, it was strategy. They saw art and knowledge as tools of influence, capable of elevating their family name to mythic heights and reinforcing their dominance without the need for weapons or crowns. It began in Florence, their city, which the Medici transformed into the beating heart of the Renaissance. They funded the young Filippo Brunelleschi, whose revolutionary dome for the Florence Cathedral defied engineering norms and became an enduring symbol of human ingenuity. They financed Donatello, whose sculptures reimagined the human form with raw emotion and spiritual power. And they gave refuge to a young Michelangelo, whom Lorenzo de' Medici personally took under his wing, raising him like a son in the palace of power and ideas. But their impact was not confined to the visual arts. They supported poets, philosophers, architects, scientists, anyone who could expand the boundaries of human thought. Under their guidance, Florence became a living academy, a city where Neoplatonism revived ancient wisdom, where humanism took root, and where the divine and the rational met in an explosion of creativity. By nurturing thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, they helped birth a new vision of humanity, one in which man was not a sinner groveling before fate, but a creator, a thinker, a force capable of shaping his own destiny. The Medici's influence extended beyond the walls of Florence. Through their support, works like Botticelli's The Birth of Venus and Leonardo da Vinci's early innovations echoed through the courts of Europe, elevating not just art, but the Medici legacy. Their name became synonymous with taste, enlightenment, and progress. When other rulers built castles, the Medici built a civilization. Art was also their most subtle form of propaganda. In frescoes and sculptures, their faces appeared alongside saints and ancient heroes. In literature, their virtues were exalted and their enemies diminished. Through every brushstroke and every commissioned masterpiece, the Medici wove a mythos of divine right, cultural supremacy, and intellectual brilliance. They didn't need to inscribe their history in marble. It was already alive in the paintings, buildings, and ideas they brought into being. By shaping the Renaissance, the Medici did more than build beauty. They built influence. They made their name immortal. They molded the very ideas that would one day define modern Europe. The Medici understood that while war could seize a kingdom, marriage could inherit it. In a world where dynastic unions determined the fates of nations, the Medici mastered the art of matrimonial strategy, weaving their bloodline into the very fabric of European royalty. With every marriage contract signed, they extended their influence, not through conquest, but through kinship. At first, the Medici were considered social outsiders, wealthy bankers, yes, but lacking noble lineage. Aristocrats scoffed at the idea of a Medici marrying into a royal family. But wealth has a way of softening disdain, especially when it comes with the promise of military funding, political alliance, or papal favor. Over time, the Medici rose from merchants to nobles, and from nobles to royalty, not by sword, but by ceremony. The most striking example of this matrimonial diplomacy was Catherine de' Medici, the orphan daughter of Lorenzo II de' Medici and a member of the junior Medici branch. In 1533, she was married off to Henry, Duke of Orleans, who would soon become King Henry II of France. Many at the French court dismissed her as a foreign banker's daughter, but they underestimated her brilliance, ambition, and resolve. As queen and later regent, Catherine ruled France through one of its most turbulent eras, exerting power over 3 successive kings, influencing religious policy during the Wars of Religion, and introducing Italian art, cuisine, and politics into the French court. Through her, the Medici didn't just enter French royalty, they dominated it. Another key figure was Marie de' Medici, who married King Henry IV of France in 1600. Her marriage brought with it a massive dowry, an essential factor in securing political peace and royal favor. After Henry's assassination, Marie served as queen regent for her young son, Louis XIII. Though her rule was marked by internal conflict and court intrigue, it also reflected the Medici strategy of remaining influential even in times of political instability. Through regency, patronage, and cunning political alliances, Marie continued the family tradition of indirect control. These were not isolated cases. The Medici forged marital alliances with the houses of Habsburg, Bourbon, and Lorraine. Each union was a deliberate act of power consolidation, giving the Medici stakes in the courts of Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire. They extended their reach not only through queens and dowries, but through ecclesiastical appointments, placing relatives as cardinals and bishops who would then secure further political marriages. These marriages were not purely familial, they were geopolitical instruments. Each one brought access to foreign courts, to military alliances, to mercantile privileges, and to social legitimacy. By embedding themselves into the ruling families of Europe, the Medici ensured that their name and their interests could never be ignored. But marriage also served a subtler, longer game. It created generations of rulers, advisors, and nobles with Medici blood in their veins. Children of these unions inherited not just titles, but a legacy of patronage, diplomacy, and cunning. In many ways, the Medici didn't just marry into power, they infused it with their worldview. Through them, Renaissance ideals, Florentine political values, and the art of subtle dominance were exported to courts far beyond Italy. Marriage, for the Medici, was not a romantic institution. It was a political weapon, quiet, binding, and enduring. It gave them access where armies could not tread, influence where banks could not reach, and permanence that no fortune alone could be to the world. The Medici were patrons of the arts, paragons of refinement, and champions of learning. But beneath the surface of velvet robes and gilded salons lay a steely core, ruthless, calculating, and unflinching. The Medici did not survive centuries of shifting alliances, papal conspiracies, and foreign invasions by charm alone. They wielded violence not as a tool of chaos, but as a precise instrument of political control. Their elegance masked a brutal pragmatism. In Florence, where politics were blood sport, the Medici learned early that mercy could be mistaken for weakness. Their enemies, the Albizzi, the Pazzi, the Strozzi, were formidable, noble families with their own claims to power. The Medici often tried diplomacy first, forging alliances, offering offices, and arranging marriages. But when persuasion failed, they did not hesitate to strike. One of the most infamous examples of this quiet ferocity was the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, a dramatic attempt to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass in Florence's Grand Cathedral. Giuliano was brutally stabbed to death at the altar, but Lorenzo survived. What followed was swift and merciless. Dozens of conspirators were rounded up, tortured, and executed. Some were hanged from the windows of Florence's government buildings as a message to the city. Betrayal would be answered not just with justice, but with spectacle. This was the Medici paradox. While Lorenzo was commissioning Botticelli's Primavera, he was also ordering the suppression of dissent. While the family funded cathedrals and science, they also kept spies in every corner of their realm. They understood that beauty and brutality were not contradictions, they were partners. To preserve the illusion of harmony, they sometimes had to silence chaos with force. Even within the church, the Medici were no strangers to ruthless ambition. When Giulio de' Medici sought to become pope, he navigated a labyrinth of corruption and manipulation, securing votes through bribes and political favors. Once in power as Pope Clement VII, he excommunicated kings, maneuvered through the Protestant Reformation, and survived the sack of Rome in 1527, a catastrophic event that laid bare the volatility of papal politics and the dangers of miscalculation. Later, when Catherine de' Medici ruled France as queen and regent, her court was no less treacherous. She used espionage, arranged assassinations, and orchestrated brutal crackdowns on Protestant factions, most notoriously during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Huguenots were killed in a single night of coordinated slaughter. Though her role remains debated by historians, Catherine's involvement in the event underlines the Medici tendency to use ruthless means cloaked in royal dignity. The Medici were also masters of psychological power. They eliminated rivals not only with daggers, but with discrediting rumors, financial ruin, and political exile. A man could wake up a respected statesman and go to bed an outcast, his fortune seized, his name smeared across Florence. Often, the Medici did not need to destroy a man physically. They simply made him irrelevant. What made their ruthlessness so effective was its discretion. Unlike tyrants who ruled through open terror, the Medici kept their knives hidden. They maintained a public image of grace and piety while quietly manipulating councils, poisoning alliances, and shaping the battlefield long before swords were drawn. Their enemies often didn't realize they were losing until it was too late. The Medici's pursuit of power was not limited to political influence or financial dominance. It extended into something far more enduring: the reshaping of culture itself. Through their unprecedented patronage of the arts, sciences, philosophy, and education, the Medici family laid the intellectual and aesthetic foundation for the modern Western world. Their cultural legacy wasn't an afterthought. It was a calculated investment in immortality. Florence, under the Medici, became a crucible of brilliance. It was here that the Renaissance, literally a rebirth of classical knowledge, exploded into life, and the Medici ensured they stood at its epicenter. They were not merely observers or passive benefactors. They were the visionaries who saw potential and genius long before it became famous, who commissioned works that would define entire eras, and who understood that controlling the flow of ideas was as powerful as controlling armies. Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, was perhaps the greatest cultural strategist the family produced. His court was a living museum, a vibrant academy where artists, poets, and philosophers gathered not only to create but to learn, debate, and dream. He supported figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Sandro Botticelli, whose works did not merely adorn walls but transformed human understanding of beauty, anatomy, nature, and the divine. These were not decorative projects. They were tools of philosophical and spiritual exploration. The Medici's influence reached beyond the canvas and the chisel. They were key patrons of Marsilio Ficino, the translator of Plato and father of Renaissance Neoplatonism. Ficino's work, funded and protected by the Medici, bridged the gap between Christian theology and classical philosophy, sparking a new humanist approach to the world, one that placed man, rather than fate or divine wrath, at the center of inquiry and creation. This intellectual revolution would reverberate through universities, religious institutions, and political thought for centuries. Their impact on science was equally profound. Under the Medici's protection, Galileo Galilei conducted his astronomical research and dedicated his revolutionary discoveries to Cosimo II de' Medici. Galileo's naming of Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars was more than a gesture of gratitude. It was a signal to the world that the Medici were not just protectors of tradition, but champions of the future. They embraced the tension between faith and reason, using it not as a threat to their power, but as proof of their relevance in an age of change. Even the architecture of Florence speaks to their legacy. The Uffizi Gallery, originally designed as a bureaucratic office by Giorgio Vasari for Cosimo I, became one of the world's first modern museums, an enduring monument to their belief in the public power of art. Palaces, chapels, and libraries across Tuscany bear the Medici imprint, each structure a testament to their aesthetic vision and their desire to shape the physical and spiritual landscape of their time. Through their investments in culture, the Medici cultivated not only greatness but loyalty. Artists and thinkers became their allies. The people, awed by beauty and innovation, came to see the Medici not just as rulers but as stewards of civilization itself. Their name became synonymous with refinement, intellect, and creative excellence, not merely in Italy, but across Europe. They embedded their ideals into the culture of courts and cities, embedding a Renaissance ethos that would influence Enlightenment thought, scientific revolutions, and democratic ideals. The Medici legacy wasn't built to last a generation. It was built to shape the soul of an era and echo through time. The Medici were not merely players in the game of power, they rewrote its rules. Long before the rise of modern nation-states, corporate empires, or political think tanks, the Medici had already laid the groundwork for how influence would be gathered, wielded, and preserved in the centuries to come. Their strategies, steeped in cunning, culture, and control, became a prototype for power structures that still echo through the corridors of governments, boardrooms, and institutions around the world. At the heart of the Medici blueprint was diversification of dominance. Unlike traditional monarchies that concentrated their authority solely in lineage or land, The Medici spread their roots through finance, religion, politics, and culture. Their power was not bound by geography, nor limited to titles. It flowed fluidly, from a vault in Florence to a cathedral in Rome, from a royal bedroom in France to a canvas in a Florentine chapel. They demonstrated that enduring influence came not from singular control, but from a web of interlinked authority. They mastered the art of soft power centuries before the term existed. Instead of military might, they used art, faith, and ideology to seduce loyalty and submission. Instead of forcing obedience, they inspired admiration and, when necessary, fear. They made allies of enemies, turned cultural influence into political leverage, and used the illusion of democracy in Florence while orchestrating every key decision behind closed doors. The Medici showed that power did not need to be visible to be absolute. Their use of patronage as a political tool was also revolutionary. By funding thinkers, artists, and clerics, they didn't just surround themselves with talent, they engineered influence pipelines. Every genius they empowered became a mouthpiece for their values, every masterpiece a silent endorsement of their legitimacy. In this way, the Medici created a new kind of propaganda, not crude slogans or threats, but beauty, science, and scholarship that inspired loyalty more effectively than any sword. Their strategic marriages, control over religious institutions, and economic innovations also contributed to what would later resemble the behaviors of transnational elites, networks of interconnected interests that operated above the law of kings or the rule of any single nation. Like modern conglomerates, the Medici could weather political storms by shifting their centers of influence, adapting to regimes, and reshaping themselves without losing control. Even their legacy management was cutting edge. By carefully curating their image through commissioned biographies, public monuments, and elaborate rituals, they constructed a mythos that transcended time. They were not content with power in their own lifetime. They planned for immortality. In doing so, they anticipated the way modern dynasties, both political and corporate, manufacture public perception to protect their brand and heritage. Most critically, the Medici understood the value of narrative. They didn't just rise to power. They told the world a story in which their power was not only deserved, but necessary. A story in which art, faith, order, and prosperity flowed from their presence. They were the original power architects, not simply ruling a city or guiding a church, but designing an ecosystem of dominance that would long outlast their own flesh and blood. In the grand theater of history, few families have left footprints as deep or as far-reaching as the Medici. They rose not by accident, but by alchemy, mixing gold with vision, piety with cunning, beauty with control. Behind velvet curtains, they did not simply watch the world turn, they turned it themselves. Popes, kings, empires, all danced to their silent tune. They were the hidden architects of modern power, centuries ahead of their time, forging a legacy that still pulses through our politics, our art, our very idea of influence. To study the Medici is not just to explore the past. It is to understand the blueprint of how the world truly works.